Dirty History is produced by Muckraker Media. So, if you value this show and podcast in general as an educational resource, please consider passing it on to another person. The best way we can spread is by word of mouth. That said, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on whatever platform you get this show on. Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, wherever you get the show, please subscribe and review. The same goes for Muckraker Media. If you like this show, there are others on the network tailored to your interest. Go check them out. muckrakermedia.org. Muckraker media. This simple act, 4 minutes of your time, will help the show more than any dollar amount could, and it will help you curate a podcast feed you're proud of. So once again, wherever you get Dirty History, please subscribe, like, review, and be sure to check out Muckraker Media. With that, on with the show. This episode was written by Dirty History contributor Emily Bailey. If you want to read the essay and check out the sources, you can do that at muckrakermedia.org. Conversely, it's also available at dirtyhistorypod.com, as well as our unique RSS feed to add to your favorite podcatcher. I'm Thompson, and this is Dirty History. It was 1984, and two men etched their names into history, but for two profoundly different reasons. Legendary musician Prince topped charts and won the hearts of Americans after releasing the sensational film Purple Rain and its accompanying soundtrack. While on the contrary, just a little over a week before the movie's release, hearts across America were shattered after hearing the news that a much less noticeable man, James Huberty, claimed the lives of 21 innocent people at a California McDonald's. This tragedy may not be considered a major hinge moment like its 1999 successor at Columbine, but nonetheless, it stunned the nation in 1984, and today it continues to raise important questions about gun violence and its perpetrators. When discussing mass murder, spree shootings, or serial murder, it is common for many in the media to find and declare the cause of the incident, whether that be the suspect's ability to legally purchase the weapon in a given state, the suspect's political affiliation, or, as I wish to discuss here, their mental health status. Words such as lunatic, insane, or mad find their way into newspaper headlines, catching the attention of Americans curious to know more about the person who single-handedly murdered multiple innocent people in broad daylight. It is easy, tempting even, to dismiss a murderer as a mentally ill basket case, and almost subhuman after a rampage like the one that took place in that California McDonald's in 1984. However, before doing so, we should ask ourselves, is it dangerous when addressing the issue of such killings to target those who are mentally ill and end the conversation there, as often happens? We determine that the person was crazy, and somehow that serves as a satisfying answer to many, thereby inadvertently including the large percentage of those with mental health concerns who are obviously not diabolical murderers. Is a perpetrator's mental illness to be the sole blame for mass killing sprees in the United States? And lastly, because the perpetrator of that McDonald's shooting exhibited signs and symptoms of a troubled mind prior to his attack, does he perfectly fit the narrative of a madman or lunatic spree killer? The lone gunman of the San Ysidro McDonald's massacre is one among many examples of a spree shooter who likely suffered from psychosis or other psychological instability and had attempted to seek help prior to the rampage. And I want to be clear, I'm not giving passes to mass murderers. They are vile individuals. Nonetheless, it is unfair and equally dangerous to solely blame mental illness for gun violence in America, as it alienates and stigmatizes a large population who are innocent individuals, and it also ignores a host of other concerns. There are no easy answers in discussing mass shootings and murder, but there is a whole field of scapegoats and places to point the finger. The argument should be that the problem is pervasive, with no single issue at heart, but a breakdown of many of our society's structures. On the 18th of July, 1984, a man drove across the street to his neighborhood McDonald's, parked his car, and carried his blanket-wrapped bundle of weapons, including a pistol, a semi-automatic Uzi, and a Winchester 1200 pump-action shotgun. And then for the next 77 minutes, employees and customers in that fast food restaurant were under siege by a rain of bullets. In fact, after the rampage had ended, 100 or more spent shells were found on the floor of the blood-splattered restaurant. That 77-minute reign of terror finally came to a long-awaited halt after a sniper, Officer Charles Foster, fired through the restaurant's window at the perpetrator, who had briefly paused to reload his weapon. Reporter David Freed spoke to officers who had arrived at the scene and was informed that the police, quote, initially delayed firing at Huberty because they thought, and they were told, he might have 15 or more hostages. Before addressing his mental health status, it is important to highlight another underlying factor in Huberty's profile. San Ysidro, California, is a small city that lies at an entry point of the U.S.-Mexican border. Because of this, the particular McDonald's restaurant that Huberty chose to carry out his act of terror was popular with Mexican visitors and American residents. There was speculation to believe that Huberty was not necessarily happy about the presence of immigrants. He had recently moved to San Ysidro with his wife and 2 children after he lost multiple jobs in his home state of Ohio. The 41-year-old was frustrated with his lack of financial success, and after moving to San Ysidro, gave his neighbors reason to believe that he at least partly blamed Mexican immigrants for this. One exclaiming to a new neighbor, quote, "Those effing Mexicans are always getting into everybody's business." This is an obviously aggressive, interrogatory statement, but it is also particularly odd that Huberty says this offhandedly and out of context to a new neighbor, a person whom he is completely unfamiliar. Apparently, Huberty never really exhibited particularly great social skills. According to one of his former employers, Don Williams, Huberty simply wasn't cut out for this profession. He acted like he just wanted to be left alone. And he did want to be left alone. But when he did react with others, he often rubbed people the wrong way, as exemplified in Huberty's interaction with the new neighbor. He was always quiet, but his tendency toward the solitary life and an apparently growing bitterness led Huberty into an obsessive pursuit of self-defense. He also maintained an interest in military-grade weaponry and firearms. Guns always played a big part of his life, as he had multiple war veterans in his bloodline. Huberty spent hours upon hours creating a makeshift firing range in his yard, cleaning his guns, modifying some, and perfecting his marksmanship. On the day of the attack, Huberty wore camouflage pants and black combat boots, which served as a reference to military uniforms. The crucial information in understanding Huberty's profile lies perhaps in the weeks and days prior to the attack. His wife, Etna Huberty, who described James as, quote, always very sad and very lonely, had reported hearing more and more often from her husband that he was having hallucinations. For example, James once described to Etna a vision in which he believed Christ to be standing in the middle of the street alongside a legionnaire on a horse. But suddenly a 15-year-old boy stabbed the horse, and the next day the legionnaire went to the boy's house and killed his parents with his sword. As well as losing touch with reality, Huberty became increasingly isolated, more so than before. And during the winter prior to his July rampage, Etna remembers her husband to have begun, quote, hearing voices and talking to people who were not there, as well as becoming, quote, obsessed with ideas about war. To Etna, Huberty was, and I quote again, slipping down a deep hole of depression and paranoia. By July of 1984, Etna had become accustomed to hearing James ramble outlandish nonsense. But this, being accompanied by his fascination with weapons, led to a growing concern. On July 17th, the day prior to the massacre, Etna called a mental health clinic, quote, fearing her husband would shoot someone. But she never received a call back, as it was later discovered that his name had been misspelled. The following day, James Huberty tied his boots, wrapped his weapons up in a blanket, and headed for the door. He stopped and spoke to his wife, Etna, who asked where he was going, and James calmly replied that he was, quote, going hunting for humans. Huberty's behavior and thought patterns prior to the rampage were undeniably eerie, bizarre, and concerning to the outside world. In fact, when this evidence was exposed after the shooting, there were many who likely wondered why somebody, particularly his wife Etna, did not stop him. If her husband had said something as indiscreet as going for a trip to hunt humans, why didn't she stop him? Why didn't she do anything? Again, when confronting these questions, it must be considered that Etna was concerned for James's well-being. We'll assume that. She did, after all, call the mental health clinic with a sense of urgency. In fact, she later expressed that she believed the tragedy could have been prevented had James been provided medication in time, saying of it, quote, I know if he had been kept in constant sedation, he couldn't have done it. If I would have had Valium or access to it, I would have given it to him myself. The matter to be emphasized here is that James, while being considerably isolated, did not lack someone in his life that cared and was concerned for his well-being and safety. Furthermore, while Etna was not successful in intervening, she cannot be solely blamed for dismissing or ignoring James's particularly unusual behavior. As well as it may have been natural to question the actions or potential interventions of those in Huberty's life, it may have also been natural to immediately associate his crime, a deadly spree shooting, with his reported mental health status and symptoms. In fact, the association of violence and mental illness is a common narrative in popular and political media. Immediately declaring an act of violence to be directly and solely related to one's mental illness likely allows Americans to believe that mental illness is, in a larger picture, the root cause of gun violence in the country. In his book, Murder and Madness, Peter Morrow eloquently explains this phenomenon, emphasizing that in this portrayal, mental illness is, quote, merely residual rule breaking. While all other categories of deviance have been exhausted, the label of madness will be put to use. After a tragedy such as a mass murder or a spree shooting occurs, the horror can only seem to be explained by one notion. Only a crazy person. Someone who clearly had something going on, who just wasn't all there in the head, would do something like this. The only explanation, as Morale touched upon, seems to be deviance. The person was an outsider from the whole of society. This type of reporting, this type of media coverage allows us to conflate mass violence with this idea of madness. And that madness is not an illness, but simply residual rule breaking. Politicians and many Americans wish to directly target the issue that seems to be the obvious cause of gun violence, the mentally ill. Rather than advocating for bills that would provide better care, easier access to help, or other funding for medical services, they wish to implement gun laws that would restrict these individuals from purchasing guns in the first place. These so-called red flag laws are currently being implemented in 14 states and are supported by President Trump to be carried out across the country. Undoubtedly, in efforts to reduce gun violence, background checks and other legislative means are necessary. Nonetheless, flagging individuals that may pose a threat to others solely for their struggle with mental health can ultimately stigmatize a large group of people living in the United States, thus preventing them from seeking out the care they need. Centering the conversation of gun violence around mental illness distracts the country, in a political sense, from providing adequate and affordable care for those suffering, as well as from the conversation about gun safety and the circulation of military-grade assault weapons. Aside from politics, the portrait of mental illness is harmful to the many, many Americans battling it every day, many of whom are not violent nor a threat to society. While it is true, as shown by Huberty's case for instance, that some people suffering from symptoms of mental illness have committed violent crimes, it is also important to consider the context in which dangerous behavior occurs, given the conditions under which many people with mental illnesses live, confronted daily with the frustrations of experiencing fear, rejection, and devaluation interactions with others. You see, associating one's crimes immediately with their battles with mental health may seem like an easy response, and as I said before, a tempting one for the media to spread in light of the recent tragedy. But this image will then become a repeating narrative that broadly associates mental illness with crime. It is an all too easy solution for frantically seeking an answer to gun violence. In his book, Mental Illness in Popular Media, Lawrence Rubin dissects the outcome of such media portrayals by defining the concept of othering as, quote, the process by which a group excludes others based on differences between those inside the group and those perceived as different. This process, he concludes, grows to represent a comfort zone in American popular culture. In Rubin's words, we also see this play out in a vital role in allowing Americans to perceive those with mental illnesses as lesser than, as almost subhuman participants in society, as others, as being different from the inside group. Huberty is just one example of a spree shooter that had reported symptoms of mental health issues, including hallucinations, isolation, and antisocial behaviors, who had attempted to reach out for help prior to committing his crime. Based upon his widow's reports, Huberty clearly exhibited what modern-day legislators would call red flags, but unfortunately, Aetna's attempts to prevent James's act and to get him help were fruitless. There is no doubt that this man is guilty for what he did on the 18th of July, 1984, and therefore shall not be excused for the deaths of those innocent people. Rather than provide excuses for Huberty and other killers who had likely suffered from psychological instability, I wish to discuss the harmful consequences of immediately determining the cause of their crime to be exclusively triggered by their mental health, or by their mental illness, rather. So rather than declaring the mentally ill to be the problem, we should declare untreated mental illness, for many, likely due to the lack of accessibility, to be a problem for consideration. James Huberty obviously had dark thoughts. He lived in his own dark world, and because of him, July 18th, 1984 will be a dark day in history. Is he, though, an accurate representation of the thousands of others suffering and isolated? Probably not. And this is no fault of Aetna's. It's no fault of immigrants. It's not McDonald's fault. In the end, James Huberty shot bullets and killed 21 people that were enjoying a meal with their family and friends. They were earning their next paycheck. They were riding bikes around the store. Perhaps we may find a solution to gun violence in America. But it won't come by pointing fingers and declaring blame, but by seeking changes, real legislative changes that address policy rather than someone's disability, thereby stripping away their humanity. There have already been too many victims. I'm Thomas Thompson, and this has been another episode of Dirty History.